I always believed life was full of surprises, bringing both joy and hardship. Growing up, I learned to take each day as it came, accepting that not everything could be controlled. My journey began in a small town with a close-knit family who taught me the value of resilience. From a young age, I craved adventure, a passion that stayed with me into adulthood. This drive led me to buy my first motorcycle, a sleek black beauty I rode everywhere. Little did I know that bike would play a major role in events that would change my life forever. In college, I met Beth, a vibrant woman who soon became the center of my world. Our relationship grew, and after graduation, we got married, dreaming of a future filled with love and success. We moved into a cozy 3-bedroom apartment, and I began my career as a mechanical engineer. Life seemed perfect, and we started planning for a family. But then, tragedy struck. My name is Tim Robinson, and the past year has been a nightmare. It started with a motorcycle crash when a truck merged onto the highway, striking me directly. After the impact, I was left completely helpless. I could only breathe and blink, struggling even to swallow liquids. I lost all feeling below my neck. The hospital doctor said I was lucky to be alive, and a settlement from the trucking company covered my medical expenses and provided lifelong financial support. After 6 months in the hospital, I finally came home, but things only got worse. "How's that?" the counselor asked. "I'm ashamed to even talk about those 6 months," I admitted, tears in my eyes. "That's okay," she said gently. "I'm here to help." I nodded and took a sip of water. She asked about my marriage, so I told her how Beth and I met in college and married soon after graduation. At the time of the accident, I was 25, and we had been married for 3 years. Beth worked as a paralegal, and we lived in a spacious 3-bedroom apartment, planning to turn one room into a nursery. After the accident, the nursery became my room to accommodate my medical equipment. Beth tried her best to care for me during the first month, but it was clear she couldn't handle it, especially the bathroom duties. She sought help from our neighbors, Don and Kathy Akin. Don was an attorney at Beth's firm, and Kathy, a nurse, checked in on me regularly. They even helped us find a home health nurse. Despite all this support, it became clear that Beth just couldn't manage. "And that's when Don stepped in?" the counselor asked. "Yes. At first it seemed innocent, but I knew he had feelings for my wife. She often broke down in tears, and he was always there to comfort her. I could hear them making out on our couch, then he'd take her into our former master bedroom to have sex. But that wasn't the end of it, was it?" the counselor pressed. I shook my head. "No," I replied. "Afterward, he'd come into my room to taunt me, bragging about being with my wife." The counselor looked concerned. "Where was his wife during all this? Was she working?" "Yes," I answered. "She often worked strange shifts, sometimes the whole night." "I see," the counselor said. "Go on." I took a deep breath. After about a month, he came into my room while Beth was in the shower. I couldn't even finish saying what happened. "Did he misuse you?" the counselor asked gently. I nodded, wiping away tears. "Yes," I whispered. "How often?" she asked. "Maybe a couple of times a week for about 4 months. He even threatened to bring his friends over." "Did your wife know?" she asked. I shrugged. "I don't know. She was never there when it happened, but she would later praise Don for helping take care of me. I'll never forget when he set up a monitor in my room so I could watch him with my wife. Beth thought it was thoughtful." "When did the misuse stop?" the counselor inquired. "The day Dr. Steiner visited," I replied. I'll never forget that day. Beth brought Dr. Steiner and my attorney into my room just hours after Don had misused me. Dr. Steiner, a short, balding man with a German accent, introduced himself. "Tim, I'm Dr. Franklin Steiner, here to discuss a possible treatment for your condition," he said. Turning to Beth, he added, "I'll take it from here. Please wait in the other room." Beth left, concern on her face. Dr. Steiner sat down and looked me in the eye. "I run a research facility on Lake Arrowhead. We specialize in 3D bone reconstruction and nerve repair. I've reviewed your case, and I think we can help you regain much, if not all, of your physical abilities. Are you interested? Blink once for yes, twice for no." I blinked once, eager for hope. "Good," he smiled. "This is experimental, but fully approved for human testing, and it will cost you nothing." He continued, explaining the procedure. They would replace my damaged vertebrae with 3D printed ones made from a composite material, stronger than the originals. Tiny electronic implants would assist in healing the nerves. The surgery would take 3 to 4 hours, followed by a few days of recovery. Dr. Steiner reassured me. If it doesn't work, you'll be no worse off than now. But I believe you'll come out stronger than before the accident. After hearing this, I blinked once again. His assistant then approached with the agreement for me to read. The assistant brought the tablet over for me to read the agreement. When I finished, Dr. Steiner asked if I agreed, instructing me to blink once for yes. I blinked once. Very well, he said, then had me sign electronically with my thumbprint. Alan, my lawyer, countersigned, confirming he had witnessed my consent. Ready to get started? Dr. Steiner asked. I blinked once. He smiled. Let's go. We have everything you'll need at the facility. He motioned for his assistant to wheel me out to a large van parked outside. Beth stopped us. Where are you taking him? She demanded. How long will he be gone? How much will it cost? Dr. Steiner replied calmly. We're taking him to my facility at Lake Arrowhead. He could be gone for several weeks depending on recovery. His doctor and lawyer are fully aware and the cost is covered. Now we need to leave. I haven't seen any agreement and I don't even know what's happening, she protested. He doesn't need your approval, Mrs. Robinson, Alan interjected. He's disabled, not incompetent. Everything was explained to him, and he agreed. You want your husband to recover, right? Of course, she replied, sounding guilty. Can I visit him? After the procedure, when he's ready for visitors, Dr. Steiner said. For now, it's best you stay here. Say your goodbyes. Beth kissed me. Get better, sweetheart. Let me know when I can visit. I stayed silent, anger boiling inside. Dr. Steiner and his assistant wheeled me out, loaded me into the van, and drove off. I saw Beth watching us leave, feeling as if I'd been rescued. A few hours later, we arrived at the facility, where nurses prepped me for surgery. I hope you don't mind, but we're starting right away, Dr. Steiner said. He turned to the nurses. Bring him to the operating room when ready. Yes, Dr. Steiner, one nurse replied. Soon they had me undressed, washed, and in a gown. I was placed on a gurney and taken to the operating room. 3 large orderlies lifted me onto the table, and the anesthesiologist began his work. The last thing I heard was Dr. Steiner saying, "Oh my." I woke up face down, immobilized in a contraption, with a tube down my throat and an IV in my arm. The contraption turned, and I found myself looking up at Dr. Steiner. You're awake, he said. The operation went well. We'll keep you immobile for a few days to ensure proper healing. The tingling and itching in your back means the implants are working. Relax, we'll talk in a few days. He checked my vitals and left. As aggravating as the tingling and itching were, it felt good to sense something for the first time in over a year. That night, 2 young nurses came to wash me. I could feel them as they washed my legs and back, shocking me. They turned the bed and continued washing my front. I caught a glimpse of them, one blonde, the other brunette. The blonde smiled. Looks like something's working down here, she said, giggling. They finished and left, offering some encouragement. I stayed in the device for 4 days. Each day followed the same routine. Morning x-rays, massages for my arms and legs, and a thorough sponge bath. With each passing day, I felt more of what was happening to me. On the 4th day, Dr. Steiner came in, examined me, and then quickly stuck a pin in my leg. I felt it and made a noise since I still had a tube down my throat. Did you feel that? He asked. I blinked once, trying to nod, though my head was strapped down. He smiled. Very good. He then asked me to move my toes and fingers. To my surprise, I could. Outstanding, he said. After reviewing my x-rays, he called in the nurses. It's time to get Mr. Robinson out of this device. They removed the tube from my throat, the catheter, and all the straps, then moved me to a gurney and back to my room. Dr. Steiner spoke to the nurses, then sat beside me. I'm very pleased with your progress. We'll start physical therapy now, but we'll keep it light at first to avoid putting too much pressure on your back. He offered me a cup with a straw. Take a drink, he said. I took a sip, and it felt wonderful. Try saying something, he encouraged. Wow, I croaked. He laughed softly. That'll do. How do you feel? Like a new man, I replied, though my voice was weak and my eyes started watering. He gently wiped my tears away. This is a big moment for you, Tim, he said gently. Take it easy for now. Your back still needs to heal, and you've lost some muscle mass. We'll start a diet and exercise program to help you recover. Dr. Steiner then introduced the staff. Angela, the dietitian, Ingrid, a short-haired, muscular blonde who would be my physical therapist, Linda, my day nurse, and Kirsten, my night nurse, a tall redhead with a warm smile. Nice to meet you, I managed to say. If you need anything, let us know, Dr. Steiner said. We're available 24/7. After the staff left, he turned to me with a more serious tone. Tim, I need to discuss something sensitive. When we began the procedure, I noticed some rectal damage and took samples. I'm not here to judge, but were you misused? I nodded, tears spilling over. Yes. I have to report this, he said firmly. It's a felony and a hate crime to misuse a disabled person. The lab is running DNA analysis. Do you know who did this? Yes, I whispered. Dr. Steiner hesitated before asking, was your wife involved? I don't know, I admitted. She was never there when it happened. Are you willing to name him? Yes. Good, he said, nodding. Once we have the results, I'll contact the authorities. I'll also arrange for you to see a counselor. Thanks, I murmured softly. You're welcome, he said, offering a reassuring smile. Now, let's focus on your recovery. They attached a weightlifting device to my bed, but Dr. Steiner didn't want me using it right away. For the first week, I did hand and leg exercises. Ingrid, my therapist, kept a strict cadence, counting in German, eins, zwei, drei, vier, as I pushed each leg. Her accent was much stronger than Dr. Steiner's, reminding me of a drill instructor. Good, she said. We'll get you some protein and build those muscles back. Soon every woman in town will be after you, she added with a laugh. And that brings us to now? The counselor listened patiently, then put down her pen and looked at me. Tim, the next few weeks will be tough, both physically and emotionally. I'm glad you opened up to me, and I encourage you to take action against those who misused you. They broke the law and should face consequences. I'm here for you, anytime you need to talk, okay? Okay, thanks, I replied. The session ended, and I was wheeled back to my room. A couple of days later, Dr. Steiner arrived with 2 men in dark suits, along with Alan, my lawyer. After asking the nurses to leave, Dr. Steiner sat beside me. Tim, these men are here to discuss your situation at home. I called your lawyer too, I hope you don't mind, Dr. Steiner said. Not at all, I replied. Alan, my lawyer, seemed surprised to hear me speak. You're looking much better, Tim, he said, shaking my hand. Thank you. I'm feeling much better. I can even eat on my own now. He's doing well, Dr. Steiner added. If things continue, he'll be stronger than before the accident. That's great to hear, Alan said. He then introduced the 2 men standing nearby. Tim, this is Agent Smith and Agent Jones from the state police. They need your statement. Are you up for it? Absolutely, I responded. The agents pulled up chairs and Agent Smith took out a recorder. Mind if we record this? Smith asked. Not at all, I said. For the next hour, I recounted the past 4 months of mistreatment by Don Akin. It was the 3rd time I had to relive it, and it was just as painful as before. So Mr. Akin attacked you repeatedly? Agent Smith confirmed. Yes, I answered. Dr. Steiner interjected. I have the samples I took, along with the analysis. It's all in my report. We'll need that for evidence, Smith replied. Dr. Steiner nodded. Smith then asked, is this the same Don Akin from McMaster and Williams' law firm? Yes, I confirmed. And your wife works there too? Smith continued. Yes, I replied. Do you allege they had an affair during this time? He asked. That's correct, I confirmed. Was your wife ever present during the attacks? Smith asked. She was in the apartment, but never in the same room as far as I know. She believed he was helping me. I see, Smith said. Even if she wasn't directly involved, she may be charged as an accessory. At this point, Alan looked shocked. Tim, are you sure about this? I know Don, and it's hard to believe he'd do this. Maybe you don't know him as well as you think, I replied. You have Dr. Steiner's report and the evidence. Alan hesitated. I assume you want a divorce? Absolutely, I confirmed. He nodded. I'll start the paperwork. We'll also get a restraining order. Agent Smith added, your apartment will be treated as a crime scene. How long will Mr. Robinson be here? At least 5 more weeks, Dr. Steiner answered. Maybe longer, depending on his recovery. Understood, Smith said. We'll secure search and arrest warrants for Mrs. Robinson and Mr. Akin. Smith then turned back to me. If it comes to trial, will you testify against your wife? Yes, I answered. At that moment, Agent Jones returned and gave a thumbs up. Warrants will be ready when we return. Smith packed up his gear and said, We'll be in touch, Mr. Robinson. I hope everything works out for you. Thank you, I replied. After the agents left, Alan approached me. Tim, these are serious accusations. Don could lose everything, his job, license, even his marriage. Are you absolutely sure? I'm 100% sure, Alan. I don't care if he loses everything. He deserves it. If you're not on my side, tell me now and I'll find another attorney. I'm on your side, Tim. It's just hard to believe. Well, he did it. Can I sue him too? Yes, Alan replied. We live in a state that allows alienation of affection lawsuits, though they rarely go far. I'm sorry, Tim. I had no idea, Alan said, shaking his head. It's not your fault. I had no way to tell anyone. We said our goodbyes, and he left. I felt some relief knowing that justice would be pursued. The next 2 weeks flew by. Ingrid had me on my feet in no time, starting with treadmill walks and then adding weight training. Angela put me on a high-protein, high-fiber diet, and I soon noticed my muscles returning to normal. Meanwhile, the authorities built their case against Don and Beth. Alan decided to hold off on filing divorce papers until Beth's arrest. Agents Smith and Jones visited a few times with state prosecutors, gathering more details on the attacks. They confirmed that Dr. Steiner's analysis matched Don's DNA. Alan also hired a PI to document their blatant affair, which wasn't hard to do since Don's wife, Kathy, worked nights and was unaware of their activities. After gathering all the evidence, Alan came to review the divorce papers with me. He was filing on grounds of infidelity, neglect, and cruelty, supported by photos, videos, and audio recordings. He also planned to sue Don and the law firm for violating company policy and to report Don to the State Bar Association for ethics violations. I couldn't help but notice that Beth never once called to check on me or visit. Apparently, she and Don were too busy with each other. This would pass, and it did. At the end of the 2 weeks, authorities arrested Don and Beth at their firm. Alan's process server was present to deliver the divorce papers. The media captured video of them being placed in police cars. The firm, shocked by the evidence, quickly settled with Alan and fired both of them. Don was also reported to the state bar. Kathy found out about the arrest when Don called from jail, asking her to appear at his arraignment for bail. Agents Smith and Jones, along with Dr. Steiner, brought me to the courthouse for the hearing. Kathy spotted me and rushed over. "How is he?" she asked Dr. Steiner. I looked at her. "Better," I replied. It had been a year since she heard my voice. "Didn't you know? Your husband misused me for months while also sleeping with Beth," I said. "Oh my God," she gasped, turning pale. "I had no idea. I filed for divorce from Beth and am suing Don for alienation of affection. If you need an attorney, I can refer you to mine." "Damn right, I'm divorcing him," she said, her voice shaking. Inside the courtroom, we watched Don and Beth in orange jumpsuits and shackles being brought in. The state prosecutor requested they be held without bail, citing Don as a flight risk and a restraining order against Beth. The judge agreed, setting the hearing for the following week. As they were let out, Beth spotted me. I raised my hand, extending my middle finger. Kathy approached me after we left the courtroom. "How are you, Tim?" she asked. "You look better." "Thanks, I'm doing much better, thanks to Dr. Steiner. I'm so sorry for what my soon-to-be ex-husband did to you." "I appreciate that," I replied. "Did you contact Alan?" "Yes. Don's father insisted on a prenuptial agreement with a strict infidelity clause. Alan's ready to use it." "Glad to hear it," I said. "If you need any help, let me know. I might need copies of those videos," she added. "Of course, whatever you need." "One last thing," she said. "I still have the key you gave me after the accident. I'll clean up your place and get Beth's things out if you want." "That would be a huge help, Kathy. Thanks." "No problem. Good luck," she said, giving me a kiss on the cheek. As she left, I marveled at how foolish Don was to cheat on such a good woman. "Done flirting," Dr. Steiner joked. "Let's get back to work." "Sounds good," I replied. "How are we getting back?" "We'll handle it," Agent Smith said. "We brought you here at Dr. Steiner's request." I sat in the wheelchair, and he brought me out to the car where we all got in. Honestly, I felt some relief using the wheelchair. I had been moving around most of the day, and I was starting to feel tired and achy. When we returned to the facility, Dr. Steiner wheeled me back to my room, where Kirsten was waiting. After dinner, she helped me get ready for bed, then went into the bathroom to change into her sleepwear, which was really just a long t-shirt. "How are you feeling?" she asked as she climbed into bed with me. "Exhausted. It's been a long day." She kissed me and rested her head on my shoulder. "Yes, it has," she said gently. "I know it's been tough, but it needed to happen. Now you can start putting it all behind you, and I'll be here to help however I can." I looked into her face for a moment before speaking. "I love you, Kirsten," I said without thinking. She smiled sweetly and kissed me on the lips. "And I love you, Tim." She rested her head on my shoulder and draped an arm over my chest. I felt happier than I had in a long time. Soon we were both asleep. The next few days flew by with Ingrid pushing me harder and harder. I found I could walk several miles on the treadmill, and my muscles had strengthened to the point where I could bench press more weight than ever before. The daily x-rays showed that my new vertebrae were working even better than Dr. Steiner had expected, and the implants had repaired almost all the damaged nerves. Kirsten spent most evenings with me, lying on the bed to watch TV or just talking. We often shared a bowl of popcorn while watching a movie, snuggling up together with the bowl on our laps. We always ended the evening with a kiss or two, or three. I started to feel like a high school boy on a date with the prettiest girl in school. On top of that, I was falling for her hard. By the time Agent Smith and Jones came to pick me up for Beth and Don's trial, I no longer needed the wheelchair. However, Dr. Steiner insisted I use it anyway, just to make sure I don't accidentally hurt myself. He went along too, not just as a witness to my injuries, but to ensure I got back safely. I sat in my chair right behind the prosecutor with Dr. Steiner beside me. I saw Beth and Don enter the room and sit with their defense attorney. They glanced at me before whispering to their lawyer. Kathy sat behind them, looking unhappy. The jury, which had been chosen the day before, took their seats, and soon the judge entered with the bailiff ordering everyone to stand. Using the rail in front of me for support, I stood up and noticed the shocked look on Don and Beth's faces when they saw me. The judge gave the order to be seated, and we all sat down. Dr. Steiner quietly asked if I was okay, and I nodded in response. The judge started the proceedings by reading the long list of charges and noting that both Don and Beth had pled not guilty. After both sides made their opening statements, the judge turned to the prosecution attorney, who called me as his first witness. Dr. Steiner walked beside me to ensure I didn't fall on the way, then returned to his seat. After I sat down in the witness chair, Don and Beth exchanged a shocked glance. They looked even more stunned when I spoke. After the bailiff swore me in, the prosecutor stood up and approached me. He started by congratulating me on my recovery, then asked about my accident and the year I spent as a quadriplegic. I understood his line of questioning. He was informing the jury of my physical condition before my treatment at Dr. Steiner's facility. Most of the questions focused on my home life, how Beth tried to care for me but couldn't manage, and how Kathy arranged for home health care professionals to look after me during the day. And at any time during this period, did your wife attempt to meet your emotional needs? The prosecutor asked. No, sir, I replied. Did she ever try to please you sexually? He asked. No, she did not, I answered. If she had tried, would it have been possible? He asked. I shook my head. I had no feeling from the neck down. I see, he said. Did she ever hug you, kiss you, or spend time with you, maybe reading a book or watching TV? I thought hard before answering, but I honestly couldn't recall much. Sure, she gave me the occasional kiss on the cheek, but that was about it. Did she take part in your care? Did she feed you, help bathe you, or assist you in the bathroom? She tried at first, but she just couldn't handle it. When did Mr. Akin come into the picture? He asked. Almost from the start, I said. Were you friends before your accident? The prosecutor inquired. Yes, we were. They lived next door, and we had spent time together before my accident. I see, so you weren't surprised to see him in your apartment then? No, like I said, we were friends. They often came over, and we'd share a beer or dinner sometimes. You say he and your wife engaged in sexual activity in your apartment? The prosecutor asked. When did that begin? I'm not exactly sure. It might have started while I was in the hospital, but I have no proof. He often let her cry on his shoulder when they visited. I think it was about a month after I got home that I first heard them. Heard them? The prosecutor asked. Yes. I could hear them kissing and moaning like they were making out. I glanced at Beth, who wiped her eyes as I continued. Then I heard them in what used to be our bed, making love. What happened then? The prosecutor asked. He would come into my room and taunt me while she showered. One day he brought in a monitor and a box, telling me it was so I could watch a real man screw my wife. Gasps filled the courtroom. Beth covered her face with trembling hands. Your Honor, the prosecutor said, as the bailiff brought in a cart holding a large monitor and a black box. This is the monitor and box Mr. Robinson mentioned. The box is a digital video recorder. The system also included 2 cameras, one set up in Mr. Robinson's master bedroom and the other in his room. We extracted several hours of footage recorded by this device. Turning back to me, the prosecutor asked, Mr. Robinson, is it your testimony that Mr. Aiken used this device so you could watch him with your wife? Yes, I replied quietly. Beth, sitting beside Dawn, turned to him with wide eyes, shocked. You scum-sucker, she hissed under her breath. Order in the court, the judge shouted, banging his gavel. Beth fell silent immediately. The prosecutor continued, looking at me again. Mr. Robinson, did you know that Mr. Akin placed a camera in your room as well as the master bedroom? I shook my head. No, I didn't. And how did your wife react to this monitor? The prosecutor asked, leaning in. She thought it was great that he got it for me, I explained. Apparently, she believed it was for watching sports on TV. The prosecutor nodded before asking, and was it around this time that the mistreatment against you began? Yes, I confirmed, my voice steady. Please tell the court what typically happened, the prosecutor prompted, turning toward me once more. Taking a deep breath, I said, after Dawn and my wife were done, he would come into my room and turn off the monitor. Then he would lift me up and I hesitated, feeling the weight of the moment. He attacked me. The prosecutor's face remained serious. Is it your testimony that he attacked you? He asked for clarification. Yes, I whispered, barely able to speak the words. Was your wife ever present during these attacks? The prosecutor continued, not looking away. Not that I know of, I replied. He always seemed to finish around the time she was done showering. Afterward, she would come in and tell me how wonderful it was to have a friend like Don to help care for me. How often did this occur? The prosecutor asked, leaning closer. About 2 or 3 times a week, I answered. And for how long? He asked, his voice steady. Approximately 4 months, I responded. A few gasps came from the jury. I glanced at them and saw some jurors glaring at Beth and Dawn with disgust and anger. Beth lowered her head, staring at the table. Don, on the other hand, sat motionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead. The prosecutor continued. So, Mr. Robinson, you estimate this happened around 35 times in total? Yes, I confirmed. Mr. Robinson, were you aware that Mr. Aiken recorded himself during these incidents in your room? The prosecutor asked, his voice taking on a sharper edge. No, I wasn't, I admitted, feeling more shame. Turning to the jury, the prosecutor addressed them. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Mr. Aiken recorded himself abusing Mr. Robinson 36 times on this device, he said, his voice filled with disdain. He paused, letting the weight of the information sink in before adding, with friends like that, who needs enemies? The defense attorney quickly stood up. Objection, he shouted. Sustained, the judge said, nodding toward the defense attorney. The prosecutor turned back to me. Mr. Robinson, thank you for your testimony. That's all for now, he said, returning to his seat. I reserve the right to recall Mr. Robinson to the stand. The judge nodded toward the defense attorney. Your witness, Mr. Green. Mr. Green remained seated at his table, eyeing me carefully before speaking. Mr. Robinson, I'm sorry to hear about your injuries, and I do wish you a speedy recovery. One question. Did you ever indicate to Mr. Aiken that you disapproved of his alleged actions? He asked, his tone slightly condescending. I couldn't, I replied firmly. I was completely disabled at the time and couldn't even speak. So the answer is no, Mr. Green pressed, leaning forward slightly. That's because I couldn't, I snapped, frustration boiling over. You moron! I slammed my fist on the wooden rail in front of me. The room went silent. I looked down and noticed a crack in the rail. I hadn't realized I hit it that hard. The judge stared at me. I'm sorry, Your Honor, I said, my anger quickly subsiding. I lost my temper. Don't let it happen again, he warned. I nodded. That's all I have for this witness, Green said, returning to his seat. The judge indicated I could leave the stand. Dr. Steiner came over and escorted me back to my seat. The prosecutor then called Dr. Steiner as his next witness. Dr. Steiner explained my injuries and the extent of my disability, detailing the damage and how he had collected samples for evidence. He described the spinal procedure he performed and my condition's improvement post-surgery. In your professional opinion, the only way for this damage to have occurred is if Mr. Robinson was attacked, correct? The prosecutor asked. Correct, Dr. Steiner replied. This would also explain the evidence found. The prosecutor nodded. Thank you, he said, turning to the jury. The sample was tested by the state. Further testing and DNA analysis showed, with 99.99% certainty, that the defendant, Mr. Donald Akin, was the source. Green looked deflated, as though his last line of defense had collapsed. He stood for his cross-examination. Dr. Steiner, you run the Arrowhead Institute of Advanced Medical Research, correct? Yes, that is correct, Dr. Steiner confirmed. You engage in some cutting-edge research there, don't you? Yeah, Dr. Steiner responded, slipping into his native German as he occasionally did. Green pulled out a piece of paper and began to read. Each of us has various defense mechanisms to cope with extreme situations. Sometimes we fall back on an alternate version of ourselves, what might be described as an alter ego. This alter ego can manifest in many ways. A normally quiet individual might suddenly become boisterous, arrogant, and overbearing. Glancing up at Dr. Steiner, he continued, for example, those unfamiliar with this behavior might develop a much different opinion of that person. Green looked back at the paper. You also mentioned something called an inner beast lying dormant within us. According to your writings, you claim to have found a way to unleash this beast to deal with specific situations. Is that true? He asked, setting the paper down. I did write that. And yes, my research has shown it to be true, Dr. Steiner responded. Green leaned forward. Is it correct that some time ago you worked with a Mr. Bill Dalton to help him find his so-called inner beast? A simple yes or no will suffice. I did work with Mr. Dalton, yes, Dr. Steiner replied cautiously, but the details of my work are protected by doctor-patient confidentiality. Is it not true that towards the end of his treatment, Mr. Dalton's house mysteriously exploded? Green asked. The prosecutor immediately objected. Irrelevant, Your Honor. Your Honor, Green interjected. We all witnessed Mr. Robinson's reaction. If you allow me, I believe there is a connection. I'll allow it for now, Mr. Green, the judge said. But please, make your point and move on. Understood, Your Honor. Thank you. Green turned back to Dr. Steiner. Are you aware of what happened to Mr. Dalton's house? I remember hearing about it on the news, Dr. Steiner replied. I also recall the police stating that Mrs. Dalton and her live-in partner were making pills with highly volatile materials. I fail to see how this connects to the current case. According to police reports, Mrs. Dalton was seen running out of the house, screaming about a monster, Green said. Likely a side effect of the pills she and her partner were making, Dr. Steiner interjected. Your Honor, this is entirely irrelevant to the case at hand, and Mr. Green knows that, the prosecutor demanded. I ask that this line of questioning be stopped. I agree, the judge said sternly. I've been more than fair, Mr. Green. Please move on. Very well, Your Honor. I have no further questions for this witness. The judge dismissed Dr. Steiner and the trial continued. The prosecutor called the state agents who had searched my apartment. Both testified that they found evidence suggesting physical misuse. Then he called on the home health care nurses who had noted similar signs in their records. However, the reports were lost in the bureaucratic shuffle, and no follow-up occurred. I have one final piece of evidence, Your Honor, the prosecutor said. With your permission, I'd like to play part of the video documenting the misuse of Mr. Robinson. Go ahead, the judge nodded. The prosecutor turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, what you're about to see is disturbing. I take no pleasure in this, but it's crucial you understand what Mr. Robinson endured for months. He turned on the monitor and began the video. The jury cringed as they watched. Dawn was clearly visible in the footage. The prosecutor paused the video and zoomed in. Ladies and gentlemen, let there be no doubt who is committing this vile act against a man who once considered him a friend. As the footage played, tears started streaming down my face in shame. The prosecutor paused the video again, looking at the jury's shocked expressions. I rest my case, he declared with disgust. The judge nodded and addressed the defense attorney. Mr. Green, you may present your case. Green stood and called Beth to the stand. Mrs. Robinson, he began, is it true that you had an affair with Mr. Akins? Yes, it is, Beth replied quietly. Can you tell us why? Green inquired, his tone gentle. My husband Tim was severely injured and I felt lost and hopeless, Beth confessed. Don was there when I needed someone to lean on. Yes, we had sex, but that's all it was, just physical. Were you aware of what Mr. Akins did to your husband? Green asked, pressing on. No, I wasn't, Beth answered firmly. If you had known, would you have done anything to stop him? Green continued. Yes, I would have, Beth replied. Thank you, Mrs. Robinson. That's all for now. Green turned toward the prosecutor. Your witness, Mr. Johnson. Johnson, the prosecutor, walked over to the monitor and selected an image showing both my face and Beth in the same frame. Mrs. Robinson, he began, addressing her firmly, you testified that you had no idea your husband was being abused. Is that correct? Yes, Beth responded. Look at his face in the video, Johnson said, pointing to the screen. The pain and humiliation are apparent to anyone. Do you expect this court to believe that you could see your husband of 3 years in such a state and not realize something was wrong? It didn't occur to me at the time, Beth whispered. Johnson pressed on. Before Mr. Akins hired home health care workers, did you ever feed or clean your husband? I tried, Beth admitted, but I wasn't very good at it. And after that? Did you make any effort to help? Johnson asked, his tone sharp. No, she admitted quietly. Why not? Johnson asked, his voice rising slightly. I don't know, Beth said, her voice barely audible. I thought Don was helping him, and I really didn't know what to do. The truth is, you abandoned him, didn't you? Johnson challenged, leaning forward. Objection! Green interrupted. I withdraw the question, Johnson said quickly. He then pulled out an audio recorder and addressed the judge. Your Honor, this is a report by Samuel Jenkins, a private investigator hired by Mr. Robinson's attorney. With your permission, I'd like to play the audio for the jury. The judge nodded. Go ahead. Johnson pressed play, and the courtroom was filled with the sound of Don's voice. So, have you thought about what we discussed? Don asked in the recording. I have, Beth's voice responded on the tape. And I admit I'm interested. Well, what do you think? Don pressed in the recording. I have to say, these past months with you have been great. Much better than my life with Tim ever was. Are you sure we can pull this off? Beth asked on the recording. Of course, Don replied confidently. I'm a lawyer, remember? I can get a judge to do whatever I want. Getting Tim declared a ward of the state will be a breeze. Johnson stopped the audio and looked directly at Beth. So, you and your lover plan to have your husband declared incompetent to take his settlement money and flee to Costa Rica. Were you being truthful to your lover then, or are you being truthful here in court? Tears streamed down Beth's face as she cried, I don't know. She sobbed harder, looking at me. I still love Tim, but I love Don too. She turned to me, pleading. Please, Tim, forgive me. I shook my head and looked away, unwilling to meet her gaze. Johnson sighed in disgust. I'm done with this witness, he said, walking away from the stand. Green, now back on his feet, called Don to the stand. Mr. Akins, Green began, we've all seen the video. I just have one question. Did Mr. Robinson ever indicate he did not consent? Not once, Don replied, a sneer curling his lips. Thank you, Green said, turning back toward Johnson. Your witness? Johnson stood up and approached Don. Mr. Akins, you graduated from Harvard Law, didn't you? Yes, Don replied, pride evident in his voice. And near the top of your class? Johnson continued. I did, Don affirmed confidently. You're highly regarded at your firm, correct? Johnson asked. Objection, Green interjected. Relevance, Your Honor. Johnson responded quickly. I intend to show that Mr. Akins knew Mr. Robinson couldn't give consent. Proceed, the judge allowed. Johnson turned back to Don. You knew Mr. Robinson was disabled, didn't you? He pressed. Don sighed but said nothing. Didn't you? Johnson demanded. Yes, I knew, Don admitted grudgingly. And you knew state law says people with Mr. Robinson's disabilities can't give consent, didn't you? Johnson continued, his voice sharp. Yes, I guess so, Don muttered. Johnson glared at Don for a moment before turning away. I'm finished with this witness, he said, walking back to his seat. The judge turned to Green. Any more witnesses, Mr. Green? No, Your Honor. I rest my case, Green replied. Very well. We'll take a 15-minute recess before closing arguments, the judge declared, banging his gavel. Dr. Steiner handed me a cup of water. You okay? He asked. I'll be fine, I replied. Johnson approached. I'm sorry you had to relive this. We're almost done, Tim. Thanks, I said. The break ended and everyone returned to the courtroom. Don, Beth, and Green looked much less confident, while Kathy appeared furious. It was the first time she'd heard most of this. The judge entered. Mr. Green, your closing statement. Green addressed the jury. This is not easy for anyone. We hope Mr. Robinson recovers. We've admitted the attack happened. But this case is about consent. Mr. Robinson never indicated he didn't consent, and Mrs. Robinson had no idea. Therefore, you must find my clients not guilty. He sat down. The judge signaled to Johnson. On his way to the jury, Johnson turned on the monitor, displaying an image of Don abusing me. Thank you, jury, for your service. The defense claims Mr. Robinson never said he didn't consent. But there's a problem. He was disabled. He couldn't speak or defend himself. The law says he couldn't give or deny consent. Johnson's voice rose. Mr. Green and Akins know this. Akins is a Harvard-trained lawyer. They've admitted the acts, and you've seen the evidence. They schemed to declare Mr. Robinson incompetent to take his money and flee. Akins took his wife and aimed to leave him with nothing. Johnson paused, then continued. 36 times, Akins misused him while Mrs. Robinson did nothing. In this state, misuse and neglect of a disabled person is a hate crime. I ask for the maximum punishment. It's time for justice. Johnson sat down and the judge instructed the jury before sending them to deliberate. He then put the court in recess. In the hallway, Alan approached. Beth signed the divorce papers. She's not contesting. In 6 months, you'll be free. Free, huh? I replied sarcastically. Why don't I feel free? You've been through a lot, Dr. Steiner said. It'll get better. I hope so. And I think I know someone who can help with that, he added with a smile. You mean Kirsten? I asked. He smiled. Yes, she really likes you. I like her too, I admitted. Good, just take it slow. No Zex for 6 to 8 weeks. I don't want to strain your back, he warned, grinning. By the way, I added, how did I crack that rail? Must be the supplements and Ingrid's therapy, he replied. Nothing to do with that inner beast stuff? I joked. He laughed. No, that's a different project. Not recommended for you with your custom vertebrae. We continued talking until Johnson appeared. Jury's back already? I asked. He nodded. That was fast. Good news for us, he said optimistically. Everyone returned to the courtroom and stood as the judge entered. We took our seats and the judge asked, Has the jury reached a verdict? We have, the foreman replied. The bailiff handed the verdict to the judge. After reviewing it, he instructed Beth and Don to stand. On the charges against Don Akins, how do you find? The judge asked. Guilty on all charges, the foreman declared. And on the charges against Beth Robinson? Not guilty on accessory to misuse, but guilty on all other charges, the foreman stated. The judge nodded, his voice stern. I've seen many cases, but this is one of the most egregious. You've not only disgraced your marriages, but also the legal profession. Turning to Don, he continued. As a lawyer, your actions disgust me. I sentence you to 450 years of hard labor, 12 years for each count of misuse, plus 20 years for the hate crime, and 8 years for conspiracy. To Beth, he said, I disagree with the jury's not guilty verdict. Still, I will follow it. You will serve 15 years for criminal neglect, negligence, and conspiracy. With parole eligibility in 10, Green stood up and addressed the judge. Your Honor, Mrs. Robinson wishes to speak with Mr. Robinson before being taken into custody. The judge looked at me. Are you okay with that? I nodded. A couple of minutes is fine. Very well. Court dismissed, he said, pounding the gavel. As Don was led away, Beth approached me. You look good, Tim, she said softly. Thanks, I replied curtly. I'm sorry. I had no idea what he was doing to you. I would have stopped it if I'd known, Beth said, her voice pleading. I find that hard to believe, I responded coldly. You have 15 years to think about it. Was there something else? I signed the divorce papers and won't contest it, she informed me. I know, I replied. Don't you want to know why it happened? She asked, her voice wavering. I don't care. It was greed and lust. The reason doesn't matter, I said firmly. Could you ever forgive me? She asked, tears welling up in her eyes. No, I intend to forget you existed, I snapped. Anything else? I do love you, she said, her voice breaking. I don't believe you. You should go. The deputies are waiting, I said, unmoved. Goodbye, Tim, she said quietly, turning and walking away. I watched her leave, feeling nothing. Kathy approached next, her expression kind. How are you, Tim? You look much better, she said. Thanks. Dr. Steiner's been a great help, I replied. I'm sorry for what my soon-to-be ex-husband did to you, Kathy said sympathetically. I appreciate that. Did you talk to Alan? I asked. Yes. Don's father insisted on a prenup with a strict infidelity clause. Alan's on it, she said, offering a small smile. I'm glad. If you need anything, let me know, I said. I might need those videos, she added. No problem, I assured her. I'll get your place cleaned up and remove Beth's things if you want, she offered kindly. That would be a big help. Thanks, I said, grateful. Good luck, I'll see you soon, Kathy said, kissing my cheek before leaving. I shook my head, thinking how foolish Don was to cheat on such a good woman. Done flirting? Dr. Steiner teased, walking over. Let's get back to work. Works for me, I said, smiling. How are we getting back? Agent Smith stepped in. We'll handle it. We brought you here at Dr. Steiner's request. I sat down in the wheelchair, and Agent Smith wheeled me out to the car. We all climbed in, and honestly, I felt a bit relieved to be off my feet. I'd been on them most of the day, and I was starting to feel tired and achy. When we got back to the facility, Dr. Steiner wheeled me into my room where Kirsten was waiting. She helped me get ready for bed and then went into the bathroom to change into her sleepwear, which was just a long t-shirt. "How are you feeling?" she asked as she climbed into bed with me. "Wiped. It's been a long day." She kissed me and rested her head on my shoulder. "Yes, it has," she agreed. "I know it's been tough, but it had to be done. Now you can start putting it all behind you, and I'll be here to help however I can." I looked into her face for a moment before speaking. "I love you, Kirsten," I said without thinking. She smiled sweetly and kissed me on the lips. "And I love you, Tim." She laid her head back on my shoulder and draped an arm over my chest. I felt happier than I had in a very long time. Soon, we were both asleep. The following weeks passed in a blur of activity. They really put me through the ringer. Ingrid's inner drill sergeant came out, pushing me to go farther and faster during each physical therapy session. On top of that, I had to visit a counselor twice a week to confront and work through the misuse I had suffered over the past year. Every day they took x-rays to monitor the progress of my spine. Kirsten stayed with me every night, and we grew even closer. Our bond deepened, and we got to know each other on a level I never imagined. After 5 weeks, Dr. Steiner finally announced that I had healed enough to go home. By then, my body was in better shape than ever, but Dr. Steiner cautioned me against having Zex for another 3 weeks. He also scheduled me for twice-monthly checkups for the next year to monitor my recovery. Despite the restrictions, I felt a mix of excitement and relief at the thought of going home, though I knew I'd miss Kirsten's constant presence. On the day I was set to leave, I wrote a note for Kirsten, expressing my feelings and inviting her to visit any time. As I was finishing up, Dr. Steiner came in with a wheelchair. Confused, I stared at him thinking, "Why a wheelchair? I can walk now." He shrugged. "Regulations," he said simply. "I get it." I sighed and sat in the chair, hoping it would be the last time I'd ever need to use one. He wheeled me to the pickup area outside. I scanned the parking lot, expecting to see the Arrowhead van. Instead, a dark blue Toyota RAV4 pulled up. The driver's side door opened and my heart skipped a beat. It was Kirsten, my red-headed angel. She walked around the car and opened the passenger door for me. Surprised, I glanced at Dr. Steiner. "Kirsten has a new assignment," he explained. "She'll be your live-in caretaker, unless you have any objections." "Absolutely not," I replied, unable to hide my smile. I shook Dr. Steiner's hand. "Thank you for everything, Doctor." "You're welcome," he said warmly. "I'll see you in a couple of weeks." Turning to Kirsten, he added, "Take good care of our boy, all right?" "I will," she promised with a smile. After helping me into the car, she got in and started the engine. I noticed several bags packed in the back. "How long are you going to be assigned to me?" I asked, trying to gauge the arrangement. "That depends on how long you need me." "And how long might that be?" I pressed. She grinned. "Conservative estimate. I'd say at least 60 years. Is that all right with you?" "Definitely," I said, laughing. She leaned over, kissed me on the lips, and then pulled out of the parking lot, heading home. When we arrived, I marked a date on the calendar, 3 weeks from now, when Dr. Steiner said I could resume all physical activities. Interestingly, it was the day after my divorce from Beth would be finalized. And yes, when that day came, we made love. It wasn't just a physical act. It was an emotional connection that filled a void I hadn't realized was so deep. For the first time in years, I felt whole again. Alan's prediction about the alienation of affection lawsuit against Don didn't go far. But that was all right because Kathy had completely destroyed him in their divorce. She stayed in the apartment she had shared with Don, and over time, she and Kirsten became close friends. About 2 years after her divorce, she fell in love with a doctor and remarried. I never visited Beth in prison, though I heard she was undergoing counseling. After 15 years, she was released on parole and took a job as a waitress at a truck stop diner on the highway. It was a quiet, obscure life, fitting for someone trying to rebuild a shattered existence. 6 months after my divorce was finalized, Kirsten and I got married. It was a small family ceremony with just a few close friends. That turned out to be a blessing, because only weeks after we returned from our honeymoon in Hawaii, Kirsten gave me the news. We were going to be parents. Our family grew quickly. We had 2 more children after our first and decided that was enough for us. The love between Kirsten and me never faded. Our lives were filled with joy, laughter, and the occasional challenge of raising a family. When our youngest left for college, we celebrated with a long-awaited around-the-world cruise. Even after all these years, she remains my beautiful red-headed angel. My health continued to improve, the implants doing their job, and eventually all the nerve damage from the accident was fully healed. Dr. Steiner went on to perform the procedure successfully on several other patients over the next decade, and now it's awaiting final approval for wider use. Looking back on everything I've been through, I can't help but think of that quote by John Milton. Every cloud has a silver lining. Yes, I went through hell after that truck ran me over. That was my dark cloud. But the life I have now outshines any silver lining imaginable.